Hi, and welcome to The Fault Line, a CMG consulting podcast exploring the pivotal moments where business strategy meets real-world pressure. Today's topic is a great one about how our customers experience our value proposition, whether it's a product or service, and how reflective that product experience might be of the realities of our organization internally. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my esteemed partner for this podcast, Kim Scribner, and I'm excited for this. I think it's a good way for us to continue building momentum as we start 2026 off with pithy themes.
It's a lot of pressure to be your esteemed partner, Gary, but welcome to the show, everyone. And today we're going to talk about how, as Gary said, your customers and various audiences experience your organization and what inside your organization might look like that can change that in both positive or negative ways. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart as a ways of working coach and consultant, constantly helping organizations improve their ways of working. It's critical that we keep in mind the external customer that feels those changes in the ways of working.
Yeah, which always, every time we start to tiptoe in this direction, makes me think of my favorite quote from Tron, fight for the user, right? Just checked my nerd box right there. So, I think as we were getting ready for this episode, Kim, you brought up something that's sort of a core principle in agile practice. And maybe we start there with some of the assertion and a little bit of perspective.
Yeah. So what Gary is referencing is Conway's law, and it's something that over the course of my career I've talked a lot about, which is the structure inside your organization. And so Conway's law is the systems mirror the communication structures of the organization that builds them. So when you're launching a product or your customers are experiencing your organization, they are going to experience communication breakdowns or strengths that you may have inside your organization. So when you think about kind of networks, if you've got lots of touch points that people need to go through when they're communicating inside your organization, that can show up potentially as a breakdown outside your organization.
The thing I love about the assertion and the reality of it, and for anybody who wants to go through that rabbit hole, there's a fair amount of good academic rigor that has validated the correlation between internal structures and interactions and how people experience product and service and interactions with your organization.
I think a really simple example, kind of to put this into maybe something that even folks would experience on a day-to-day basis as a customer of an organization, is that if you have silos, for example, between customer service and a warehouse that's shipping merchandise, for example, and they don't have systems that keep them well communicated with each other, you can immediately experience that breakdown as the customer of the organization. The other thing is, like, if there's lots of layers for approvals to happen, you've got a very kind of like hierarchical organization where things have to go kind of all the way up and then across and then all the way back down and then all the way back up and across and back down. That's time we really just don't have these days.
Or even if, somebody's willing to, the hassle factor of having to get my boss's boss aligned to have a conversation with their counterpart in a different function who may then cascade it. And, by the time the feedback loop completes itself, the customer may have moved on. They're like, this is just hard. And it shows up when there's a problem. Hey, something broke. Can I get, a fix or a remedy? In other cases, it's a customer coming and saying, hey, could we evolve how this happens? I'd like my software to work a little bit differently, or I'd like my widget to function a little differently. And those realities do play out. And it's it's interesting, the self-reinforcing nature of it as well. I've worked with an organization in the past where the customer service team, which had primary accountability for responding when there was an issue with their product line, found the engineering group to be so sort of difficult to coordinate that they just started hiring their own engineers. And so there were two things that happened. One, they would bring people in from the outside who maybe didn't have familiar familiarity with the product. The other was they started to cannibalize their own sort of source of value overall for the enterprise to bring some of those talented people in to serve the customer. And in doing some of the work there, the solution was not you need more engineers. It was why is it that you can't just talk to the engineers who are already on staff? Let's look at how people are, compensated. Is everybody aligned on serving the customer, right? There's a theme there around objectives, I'm guessing. It looks like you've got something
No,
to share
I mean,
on
the
that.
former DevOps manager and release engineer, release manager in me is thinking about the technical debt you're creating by doing what you're talking about for the future. So I'm getting a little buzzy from it. But also the other part is when you think about having aligned key performance indicators versus non-aligned key performance indicators, right? So simple examples. So I've, friends who work in the car business. Well, if you're incentivized to sell a car at a used car dealership, but your service department is incentivized differently, how do those things make the entire dealership work well together? So that's another competition point that can break things down that can destroy your customer experience, right?
Absolutely.
And when we think about the folks that we work with from often from a marketing perspective, it's just how do you communicate things in those different channels? So if you don't have an alignment from that perspective. So lots of examples.
Yeah. And just to riff on that theme of objectives, right? It's normal for organizations to divvy out accountability based on function or expertise or areas of competence. And at the same time, there is space and real benefit, especially at the top of the house, to share objectives. I worked with a very successful startup a number of years ago, and one of the key enablers of them as they were in the very early stages in churning was that everybody, regardless of function, adopted their customer net promoter score as a key deliverable. And that played out in HR in terms of what are the characteristics we hire for our call center. It played out in terms of engineering and software development in terms of how are we going to tether ourselves to what's better, right? It's not better if it just serves us. It's got to be better in the eye of the customer. And despite all of the foibles of humanity that show up anytime people get together to do work, that element of commonality was a catalyst for good collaboration. And, this is a startup that grew very rapidly and grew to some prominence pretty quickly. And, in reflecting on it with a few of the leaders, even several years later, they would go back and say, the fact that we all had this base layer of this is what success is in common was a big help.
I'm smiling because what you've just talked about is why a startup environment is my most favorite place to work, is because there is much more easily a common goal, and the communication structure inside the organization is much flatter and open. So there is no you have to talk to so-and-so who then has to talk to their boss, or there's less likely that tension that exists in communications, or, that's not in my wheelhouse, that's not in my department. And you're building the leading practices for the whole organization instead of these are the leading practices for a warehouse, these are the leading practices for a call center, these are the leading practices for software development, right? You're building organizational leading practices, which helps improve how your customers, members, and audiences experience the organization.
Sure. And I think, the word that you didn't use there that I'll throw in is you're building culture.
Yes.
You're building a sense of value that is rooted in serving somebody else. And it can be done even in big organizations at scale. But it takes effort, right? Because it is a change. And for me, part of playing back to leaders in, let's say, a much more mature and structured and compartmentalized organization is to highlight to them sometimes the randomness of the customer experience. So, again, working with a call center many years ago, if somebody called in and said, hey, I've got a question or I've got an issue, and they got a particular person who was working the phones, they were in luck because that person had well-established relations across all different parts of the organization. So they had the know-who to actually get answers quickly, but their counterparts often didn't. And so the variability in how people perceived the service levels and other things was something that we used to sort of establish a set of aspirations and then a change agenda to go with it. Because ultimately, you don't want the informal network to trump the formal network constantly, or to train people to only ask for 20% of your team, because those are the 20% who know how to get past all the sort of rigid barriers and other things. You want to actually open that all up, if that makes sense.
I think when you were talking about culture, something that kind of resonates for me is there's a difference between the culture that is written down in some employee handbook or onboarding deck or something versus the culture that's observed. And that gets to the heart of what we're talking about, because it's not the culture that's in your employee handbook that your customers experience. It's the observed culture,
It's the reality.
real one
Yes.
that your customers experience.
Yeah. And something that we touched on is you can't talk your way around the user experience.
Yes.
Right. And you can make all the assertions you want, but if in reality you're not acting in accordance with those assertions, you're going to lose competitively. You're going to lose in terms of talent retention. You're going to lose in terms of commitment to make the organization succeed among your existing team. There's a lot of downsides to that lack of authenticity. Now, the flip side is there's a lot of benefit when people do perceive that they're rewarded for acting in accordance with those values. And so somebody who stands up with a big title and says, we are committed to delivering for our customers, even if it means going the extra mile or whatever else, the celebratory cycle of elevating those instances can have a massive positive impact. And, again, this is when we talk about change agenda, this idea of how we're structured, how we act, what we believe showing up in the eyes of our customers comes right back to the surface in that regard.
Yeah. You had shared, I think it was last week, you and I were chatting, and you had shared a conversation about kind of the hospitality industry or restaurant industry, I
Oh,
think.
yes.
You want to say more about
Yes.
that?
Oh, I would love to. Yeah, this goes back to a book I read many, many years ago, and a gentleman I met, Danny Meyer, probably most well known for having founded the Shake Shack and done some other stuff. But, his premise was, if I treat my team, my employees like their family, they're going to treat our guests like their family. And this idea of nurturing and taking care of the people who deliver the experience in his restaurants became fundamental, to the point that he did write a book about it. And, when I told that story, Kim started nodding her head, and you could tell there was some enthusiasm there. And so probably good to dish it back to you for a little perspective.
Yeah, I just think there's, I was having a similar conversation with another colleague of ours, Sarah Smith, and we were talking about the ability to have this kind of like unreasonable expectation of what you will do that it like takes you all the way up to the line in terms of hospitality. And so her and I happened to be sitting in a restaurant together talking about this book, and she was talking about her steak being undercooked, and the manager on duty of the restaurant we were in told her why hanger steak has to be cooked a certain way instead of apologizing for her experience. And so it was kind of ironic. We had this opposite of what we were trying to talk about kind of experience at the time, that somewhere inside that organization, there's probably a little maybe defensiveness being coached into the manager on duty instead of let's make the customer experience the best it can be, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if we have to give away another steak, whatever that thing is in your organization.
It's funny you tell that story. It reminds me of another one where I was back in the day in a focus group setting, sitting behind the two-way mirror with my colleagues, and we happened to have our CEO in the room. And we were doing some user experience work with, our target audience who were trying our product. And at one point, and let's be honest, the user experience was not great, and we were hearing it. And our CEO came out of his seat and banged on the backside of this two-way mirror and was yelling, "You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong." And it was, for a lot of people who were on our side of this thing, it was like a whoa, let's recalibrate here moment. And it was incredibly insightful because it did show how much of a bias there was for the way, in his case, he thought things should be, rather than listening to what our users were telling us that would say, you know what, for better or for worse, the way you're doing this is confusing to me. And as a good friend of mine says, if we're explaining, we're not selling. And so let's avoid the idea that we've got to explain to our users how they're wrong. Let's actually figure out a way to serve their needs that works for them. Which sort of is a bridge for me back to where we started, which is how organizations are structured and how easy that process of evolution may be, or how difficult it may be, depending on the kind of organizational structure and communications channels there are.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I think we can take it to a really simple example to start, which kind of pre-agile ways of working in a marketing organization. You would have a team of writers, you would have a team of designers, you might have a team of web specialists, and they would each do their individual work along the way. And those silos potentially did not allow for the best solution to come out. And when we think intentionally about the experience that we want a customer to have, which is we want them to experience all pieces, all types of media in the same way, right? So we don't want them to see a video that's different than the writing, that's different from a social media post, right? That experience needs to be consistent. That's a very simple example of what we're talking about, where when you've got silos between those functions, you potentially have suboptimal results in what you're delivering.
Sure. And, in that regard, you get into organizations where there are high barriers between the functions, whether that's engineering or sales or marketing or corporate communications or human resources. There may be a very clear statement of intention in terms of vision and mission and even strategic priorities that gets interpreted through the filters of each of those discrete buckets or segments within the overall enterprise. And, that's when stuff shows up and it's different or it feels a little disjointed. Now, at the other end of that spectrum, you can have something where, an organization where everything is so integrated, so unified that it almost feels monolithic.
Kills creativity.
And there's a tremendous amount of organizational drag because there's no room for deviation or evolution, or in order to execute some evolution, we got to go check in with 47 different stakeholders to make sure they're aligned. And so my sense is, as we talk about this, is to, the optimal solution is somewhere in the squishy middle, where there's enough structure and discipline to be able to act with enough fluidity and flex to be able to improvise. And that, to me, is a sort of a sweet spot aspiration that is instructive because it helps us assess where on that spectrum we are and calibrate how customers are responding as we look at things like their comments or their choices in terms of loyalty or commitment to the brand, right? There's a number of different aspects there. And so, you can ask yourself, are we being too fragmented or are we being too rigid?
I think one thing that I have advised leaders to do in the past, as leaders think about how their teams are organized, what their org chart looks like, whether it's in a function or higher level, is to remove the people, the specific people, as they're thinking about the design, because humans are this is going to sound very direct. Humans can be a limiting factor. So, so how do we in our design of organizations that we want customers to experience, kind of not think about Gary Lancina specifically as a human, but what are the roles and the communication touch points between the roles and the functions that we would create in order for our customers to have the best experience outside of our organization. So it's a little bit of that outside in thinking, right? What do your customers want and need from your organization? And then how do you think in a creative way to not try to put the people you have today into square peg round hole thing.
It's interesting. My initial reaction is there's two complementary things that help with that. One is very human centric, stakeholder mapping. Who and how, right? Who's being served, who plays which roles, map it all out. The trick there is to divorce the names of the people and really just think about their roles. The second is to be more information centric and process flow. And to think through for a particular topic. I do not have the kind of product you sell. I want, or I'm interested in the kind of product you sell. I have the kind of product you sell. In fact, I have yours, and I have a question. I have a product that you sold me and it broke. I now want a fix, right? So you can take those topics and ask the question, how that information may or may not get through the organization and back in terms of resolution.
Yeah.
And the stakeholder mapping and the information flow really kind of come at the same thing from a couple of different directions. But this idea of assessing the complexity or the relative simplicity of getting to a resolution, how many touches does it take? It's the old, how many licks to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop thing. But, how many modes and nodes does information have to go through to get a warranty claim processed?
To pull the consulting term into it, right? It's like the jobs to be done by your audiences.
Absolutely.
And who they connect with has an influence on that. How many times, right? Like people in a world today, I want my Amazon package that I can stop at any UPS store or a variety of other places, pop into Kohl's and give it back to them, and it gets returned. What is that experience like in other organizations?
Correct. And, and that's something that, there's a ton of sophistication and subtlety behind the scenes to manage that. So you sort of invest in the complexity and sophistication of the information flow to simplify the touch points for the user. And, that's where the balance and the trade-offs start to become pretty explicit. And, that to me is also part of just saying something like that. How do the people who are listening to this podcast react, right? Would that work with my organization? Well, if the answer is, no way, that's an opportunity to sort of reflect on why or why not. And
Right.
if somebody says,
And I
oh,
think
yeah, we
that's
got
right.
that.
That happens often. We go into
Absolutely.
situations often where the first thing that we will hear, if we were trying to help an organization redesign based off of their customer experience, would be, we can't do that because, and they would list off all the reasons why things can't be done. Right. And so what we're talking about here is not easy. Like we're not saying, oh, it's so simple. Just go think about Conway's law and just design your organization the way your customers want to experience it. There's lots of step changes that have to happen in between those two things. But I think the first step is just acknowledging the reality that this is what's happening to your customers and you can do something about it.
Absolutely. And, there's an element there. Again, it's a key theme for the two of us, right? Be user-centric. Think of the people you're serving. Think of how empathetic you can be to them, because the better you understand and appreciate them, the better you can serve them. And then bolt that together with the three simple words, how might we? Right? And that's a theme for a podcast episode unto itself. But this idea of, before you say we can or we cannot, just ask the question, how might we? And fill in the blank, because that creates some room for exploration and might shine a light towards what better feels like. Because in the eye of your customer, even a little bit better is going to be appreciated, right?
So those of you who are only listening, I'm smirking because Gary and I have been talking about the customer as the only person who feels this change that or this organizational design that we're talking about. So if it's complicated internally, it reflects poorly to your customers externally. However, it also reflects internally to maybe one of your key constituencies, which is your employees, right? So
Absolutely.
if your organization is designed in such a way that it is difficult to get a decision made inside your organization, then your employees are going to get frustrated. And then also that is going to reflect to your customers, right? Frustrated employees answering the phone in a call center is a simple example of that, right? They get frustrated. That frustration rolls over onto the customer. And so I think when you're thinking about your stakeholder groups, one that we often forget about when we're thinking about outside in perspective is our employees, and we cannot do that.
Well, and they're the enablers of good experience, and they themselves have their own experiences. And this is part of the whole Danny Meyer thing. Was he's like, listen, unhappy employees are going to deliver poorly for the guests in my restaurants. So, how do I ensure that the people who work here understand how much I, as an owner, appreciate them, and by extension, how much we as a team appreciate our guests? And that's a fascinating feedback loop, because it's not necessarily how everybody starts, right? And we just did a podcast recently about efficiency versus resiliency. Well, an obsession with efficiency can also undermine the good experience. It's not just about resilience. It could be about customer delight. It could be about employee engagement and commitment to the cause, because it does feel good to be part of a team doing good. And when we miss that, then you can start to watch your attrition rates go up and, other things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, the examples we've been talking about where there is a direct business to consumer experience where you're delivering a service directly to a customer. It's a lot easier to see some of the things we're talking about, but they apply to large organizations as well. And it's a little bit more distant when the customer experiences those internal frustrations in the organization, but it does still apply to those as well.
Yeah. And, whether you're working on a factory floor and your customer is the next station on the manufacturing line, or you're creating software, or, working a customer service line, there's a lot in this topic that can be very, very beneficial. And again, what I would encourage is go down the rabbit hole, read about this idea of the way people in the organization and the organization communicates and shares information, shows up for your customer, and how your customer experiences your products and services is a reflection of the reality of how you handle information and choice and work together. That feedback loop is a rich vein to tap in terms of reflection and where getting better may be sourced. Any final thoughts, Kim? I know this has been a good conversation so
I
far.
think one kind of final thought is, as you think about what to incentivize inside your organization, make sure it reflects the things you're trying to accomplish with your customers. So we talk about measure what matters on a pretty regular basis, but incentivize what matters. If we're only focused on revenue targets as a goal inside the organization, how might that poorly reflect your customer experience? So what are the things that are important for your customers that you can incentivize to your employees?
Terrific. Terrific. And has already queued up more topics for the next time. So, as always, thank you everybody for listening to The Fault Line, CMG Consulting's podcast. Find us anywhere you get your podcasts, or follow us on LinkedIn, or as I always say, come to cmgconsulting.com and check out the whole back library and catalog. Lots of good conversations to be had, and hopefully good information and insights for you as you go out and do good in your own